My name is Evelyn, and I'm 61 years old. I never thought my final days would be shaped by betrayal. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air, sharp and unforgiving, a constant reminder that I was no longer in the comfort of my home. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was my only consistent companion, a mechanical lullaby that mocked the silence surrounding me. I had come to this hospital expecting fear, expecting pain, perhaps even expecting death. What I had not expected was the crushing loneliness that pressed down on me harder than my illness ever could. For most of my life, I believed in family. I believed in sacrifice, in loyalty, in giving everything so that my children could have better lives than I did. When my husband passed away, I carried the burden of our entire household on my shoulders. I worked double shifts at the diner, stood on my aching feet until late at night, and saved every penny I could. I sewed clothes when we couldn't afford new ones, clipped coupons to stretch our meals, and sold the jewelry he once gave me just so my children could have rent money when they were struggling. I never complained, never asked for repayment. All I wanted was to see them thrive, to see them succeed. And they did. My son went to college without debt. My eldest daughter bought her first home with the help of my savings. My youngest always had a place to return when the world was too much for her. I gave them everything I could, sometimes even at the expense of my own happiness. I told myself it was worth it. That one day, when I was old and frail, they would be there for me, just as I had been there for them. That one day, I would not be alone. But as I lay in that cold hospital room, the truth became unbearable. They weren't there. At first, I tried to make excuses for them. Life is busy, work is demanding, the children must have sports or homework. I told myself not to be selfish, not to expect too much. Yet each day that passed, the excuses felt thinner, more fragile, until finally, they broke under the weight of reality. My family was not coming, not in the way I needed them. The nurses were kind. They stopped by to check my vitals, to ask how I was feeling, to make sure I wasn't in pain. Some of them lingered for a chat, bringing a warmth to the room that eased the sting of silence. But their kindness also made the absence of my own children so much more glaring. I would hear the laughter of families visiting other patients, see husbands holding their wives' hands, hear the squeals of grandchildren climbing onto their grandparents' beds. And I would close my eyes, imagining it was me surrounded by love. When I opened them again, all I saw was the empty chair beside me. I tried not to cry, but tears came anyway. They came late at night when the halls grew quiet, when the world outside went to sleep. I whispered to my late husband, asking him why our children had grown so distant, why they had abandoned me in the very moment I needed them most. I wanted to believe he would have been different, that he would never have let this happen. But death is cruel. It leaves you with no answers, only questions that rot inside your heart. When my children did appear, the visits felt hollow. My eldest daughter brought flowers once, setting them on the table without much care. She stayed only long enough to glance at her watch and mention she had a dinner party to attend. My son sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, muttering half-heartedly about work before rushing out the door. My youngest promised to visit tomorrow, but tomorrow stretched into 2 weeks before she appeared again. Their words were shallow, their smiles strained. It wasn't love they brought into the room, but obligation, and I could feel it, burning in my chest like a second illness. I tried to tell myself it was enough, that any visit was better than none, but deep down, I knew the truth. They didn't want to be there. Not really. What hurt most wasn't their absence, it was what they chose to say when they were present. They didn't ask about my health, about how I was truly feeling, about the pain or the fear I was facing each day. Instead, their words drifted toward the future, my future without me. My eldest daughter casually brought up the house, wondering aloud how much it might be worth to renovate. My son hinted at the savings account, his tone careful but hungry. My youngest laughed about who might get my jewelry collection one day. I sat there in silence, my lips pressed tightly together, while inside, something shattered. They weren't just distant, they were circling me like vultures, already planning their lives around what I would leave behind. I had become less of a mother and more of a bank, less of a person and more of an inheritance waiting to be divided. I smiled at them, because that's what mothers do. We smile through heartbreak. We smile through betrayal. But inside, I was screaming. I wanted to ask them how they could be so cold, how they could forget the nights I stayed awake sewing their clothes, the mornings I skipped meals so they could eat, the years I spent giving up pieces of myself just to keep them whole. I wanted to grab their hands, force them to look into my eyes, and demand to know, do you even love me? Or was it always just what I could give you? But I didn't say those words. My body was weak, my voice too frail. So I endured. I endured the silence when they left. I endured the shallow affection when they came. I endured the hollow conversations about my belongings instead of my life. And each day, the betrayal grew heavier, pressing into my chest, making it harder to breathe. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I overheard two nurses outside my room. They were talking about another patient, one who had a room full of visitors every day. I heard one of them say softly, "It must feel good to know. Your family loves you until the very end." The words cut into me like glass. I turned my head toward the empty chair at my bedside, and for the first time, I let the truth settle fully in my chest. No one was coming. Not in the way I longed for, not in the way I deserved. The family I had sacrificed my life for had already abandoned me. And that night, something inside me changed. The grief I had been drowning in hardened into something else, something sharper. It wasn't sorrow anymore, it was rage. But nothing prepared me for the day they all stopped coming altogether. The silence of my hospital room echoed louder than any betrayal. Days blurred into one another, each marked only by the rising and setting of the sun through the half-shuttered window. I would sit upright in bed, staring at the door, listening for footsteps that never came. Every creak of a shoe in the hallway made my heart leap in hope, only to crash when it was just another nurse or a stranger passing by. I wanted so desperately to hear the sound of my children's voices, to see their faces appear with even the faintest trace of love, but all I received was silence. The silence wasn't empty, it was loud. It screamed at me in the dead of night when the halls were quiet. It mocked me every time another patient's family arrived with balloons, with laughter, with hugs. It grew unbearable when I saw a woman my age holding her granddaughter's hand, smiling weakly yet content because she wasn't alone. I tried not to look, but envy gnawed at me. I wanted that joy. I wanted that comfort. Instead, I had an empty room and a heart that felt abandoned. I thought back to the countless nights I stayed awake for my children. Nights when fevers raged and I sat by their beds, sponging their foreheads, whispering prayers until morning. Nights when they were heartbroken and I held them close, letting their tears soak into my clothes. Nights when money was tight and I skipped my own meals so they could eat. I thought back to every sacrifice, every moment of love freely given. And now, when I was the one lying in bed, weak and afraid, where were they? Where was that love returned? I remembered the funeral of my husband, standing in the rain with our children clinging to my dress. I promised them that day I would take care of them, that they would never feel alone. And I kept that promise. I worked myself into exhaustion to hold our family together. But the bitter truth was sinking in. The children I had fought so hard to raise no longer saw me as a person worth fighting for. The betrayal stung most during visiting hours. I would watch as families gathered around other patients, laughter filling their rooms, gifts and flowers brightening their bedsides. Nurses would come in afterward and apologize softly, as if they felt guilty for me. They would say, "Maybe tomorrow your family will come." I would nod and force a smile. But deep inside, I knew tomorrow would be no different. The nights were the hardest. I lay awake, the soft hum of machines surrounding me, and I would press my hand against my chest, feeling the steady thump of my heart. Each beat whispered a cruel question. Had my entire life been wasted on people who couldn't love me back? For the first time, I began to wonder if my sacrifices had been mistakes. I thought of the promotions I had turned down so I could be home more often, the vacations I never took because the money was better spent on my children, the countless times I said yes to their needs and no to my own. Was it worth it? Did they even remember? Or had they simply expected it from me, like it was my duty to give without ever receiving? The answers I found in my heart terrified me. They didn't come. Not when I begged silently for company. Not when I needed to hear their laughter to fight off despair. Not when the days stretched endlessly into nights and the walls of the hospital room became my prison. When they did come, it wasn't to bring me joy. It was to check boxes, to appear as if they cared. They stayed for minutes, not hours, and their conversations always steered back to themselves. How busy they were, how stressful their jobs were, how much their own children demanded of them. I wanted to scream at them. Can't you see that I'm dying inside? Can't you see that I need you more than ever? But I swallowed the words, afraid they would sound desperate, afraid they would only push them further away. The worst part wasn't even their absence, it was the casual cruelty of their indifference. My eldest daughter left one evening after barely 10 minutes, saying she had to make it to a friend's dinner party. My son, during his single visit that month, didn't even put down his phone long enough to look me in the eyes. My youngest promised she'd be back tomorrow, but tomorrow turned into days, then weeks. I stopped believing her promises. I stopped believing any of them. The truth sat heavy on my chest. I was not a priority in their lives. I was not their mother anymore, not in the way that mattered. I had become an afterthought, a burden, a fading figure in the background of their busy worlds. And the knowledge of that betrayal was worse than the illness tearing through my body. One night, after yet another day of emptiness, I overheard something that cracked me open completely. The patient next to my room had visitors, dozens of them. His laughter carried through the thin walls, his grandchildren's squeals of joy echoed down the corridor. A nurse outside whispered to another, "He's so lucky. His family never leaves his side." Lucky. That word pierced me. I wasn't lucky. I was forgotten. My family had abandoned me, and no one dared say it aloud because the truth was too cruel to face. I stared at the chair by my bed, the one I had hoped would be filled by my children, and I felt a rage building inside me. It was new, foreign, and sharp. For 8 weeks I had let sorrow consume me. I had let loneliness drain me. But that night, as I stared into the emptiness, I felt something shift. No more tears. No more waiting for people who clearly didn't care. No more clinging to the fantasy that my children loved me the way I loved them. The grief hardened into resolve, and the silence no longer broke me. It fueled me. And in that moment, a thought whispered across my mind, dangerous, bitter, and electrifying. Maybe I had given too much. Maybe I had been a fool all along. And maybe, just maybe, I still had one last chance to show them the weight of their betrayal. And that night, for the first time, I whispered to myself, maybe they don't deserve what I've saved for them. The thought of changing my will struck me like a lightning bolt. It came suddenly, uninvited, like a whisper in the dark. For weeks, I had been drowning in sorrow, replaying every sacrifice, every memory of love I had given my children, only to be left in this sterile room with nothing but machines to keep me company. But that night, as I stared at the ceiling, something inside me broke free. My grief turned into a sharp clarity. I couldn't change the past, but perhaps I could control the future. And the future, at least the part that lived on after me, was written in one thing: my will. Until that moment, I had never questioned it. My estate, my house, my savings, what little treasures I owned had all been neatly divided among my 3 children. It seemed natural, fair. A mother works for her children, and in the end, she leaves them her legacy. But as I lay there, listening to the silence they left me in, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Do they deserve it? The answer that rose inside me was cold and merciless. Number. They didn't. I thought of my eldest daughter, already making casual remarks about my home as if it were a project waiting to be flipped for profit. I thought of my son, his eyes glued to his phone while I lay in bed longing for a single word of comfort. I thought of my youngest, whose promises dissolved like mist the second they left her lips. These were not the actions of children who loved their mother. These were the actions of people already counting what I was worth in dollars and cents. And yet, there were others. Strangers, really, who had shown me more care in weeks than my own flesh and blood had in years. The nurses who sat by my side when I couldn't sleep, adjusting my pillows, rubbing my hand, whispering, "You're not alone." The janitor, Miguel, who always peeked into my room to ask if I wanted the blinds tilted so I could see the sunset. The cafeteria lady who slipped me an extra pudding cup when she saw my appetite fading. These people didn't owe me anything, yet they gave me compassion freely, without expecting a dime in return. I realized, then, that family wasn't always about blood. Family was about love, about presence, about loyalty. And by that definition, my children had stopped being my family long ago. A strange calm settled over me as the idea of rewriting my will took shape. It wasn't just about money, it was about justice, about teaching them, even in my absence, the lesson they had refused to learn while I was alive. That love is not a transaction, and betrayal carries a cost. I let the idea roll around in my mind for days. At first, I felt guilty. What kind of mother disinherits her own children? The guilt gnawed at me, whispering that I was being cruel, that perhaps they were just busy, that maybe I was overreacting. But then I remembered the empty chair by my bed, the unreturned calls, the hollow visits where my belongings mattered more than my health. And the guilt began to fade. Every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself, when I was strong, they needed me. When I became weak, they abandoned me. Love that disappears when it's no longer convenient isn't love at all. I began to imagine the look on their faces when they discovered the truth. The shock, the anger, the disbelief. They would call me selfish, vindictive, maybe even insane, but none of that mattered because the truth was simpler. They had written themselves out of my heart long before I ever considered writing them out of my will. The more I thought about it, the stronger I felt. For the first time since being admitted, I felt powerful. Here, in this hospital bed where I had been stripped of control over my body, my health, my time, I still held one weapon: my legacy, my choice of who would benefit from the life I had built. One night, Miguel came in to empty the trash. He smiled kindly, asking how I was feeling. I told him, half jokingly, that he had been more of a son to me than my own. His face softened, and he patted my hand, not realizing how true my words were. When he left, I stared at the door long after it closed, thinking, why shouldn't someone like him inherit something from me? Why shouldn't the nurses, who have shown me more humanity than my children ever could, be the ones I thank in the end? I closed my eyes and saw it clearly: my children, waiting eagerly for the reading of the will, their greedy hands ready to snatch everything they believed was theirs. And then, the revelation. The gasps, the outrage, the stunned silence as they realized I had left nearly everything to others. The vision made me smile. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. It wasn't just revenge. It was justice, a final act of truth, a way to make sure that, even after my body was gone, my voice would still be heard. But with that decision came a new kind of urgency. My health was failing, my days were numbered, and I couldn't waste any more time. If I wanted this will rewritten, it had to be done soon. The idea no longer frightened me, it consumed me. I began planning. quietly, in my mind. How I would speak to a lawyer, what I would say, who I would include, who I would cut out, without hesitation. The thought gave me energy, a strange fire in my veins. I was no longer a helpless woman lying in a hospital bed, waiting for death. I was a mother with one last story to write, and I would make sure every word of it was sharp enough to leave a scar. And with each passing day, my determination grew stronger. This wasn't just about inheritance, it was about dignity, about reclaiming the power my children had tried to strip from me with their neglect, about ensuring that my legacy went to those who truly deserved it. I had spent my entire life giving freely, never demanding repayment. Now, at the end, I would demand accountability. Not with words, not with anger, but with ink on paper that could never be erased. As I stared at the ceiling that night, the plan fully formed in my mind, I whispered to myself with a calm I hadn't felt in months. They won't see this coming. Not in a million years. And that was the night I decided I would not die the fool they thought I was. The next morning, I asked the nurse to bring me a lawyer. The words felt strange on my tongue, almost unreal. For weeks, I had felt powerless, trapped in a body that was failing me, ignored by the people who should have been my lifeline. But as soon as I spoke those words, something shifted. For the first time since being admitted, I felt like I was the one steering the course of my life again. The nurse blinked at me, clearly startled. She was a kind woman named Laura, the type who always tucked my blanket a little tighter and made sure my water was within reach. Her brows furrowed as if she wondered whether I truly knew what I was asking. "A lawyer?" she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of it. "Yes," I said firmly. My voice wasn't strong, but my conviction carried it. "I need to change my will." Laura hesitated. I could see the flicker of concern in her eyes, as though she feared I might be acting out of bitterness or confusion. But then she nodded gently. "I'll speak with the social worker," she promised. "We can arrange for someone to visit." As she left the room, I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. My heart pounded not from fear, but from exhilaration. The decision was no longer a thought in my mind. It was real. The process had begun. The hours stretched long before anyone returned. I lay in bed, rehearsing the conversation I would have, imagining the faces of my children when the truth came to light. For years, I had been their safety net, their caretaker, their provider. But this time, I would teach them what it felt like when the net was gone. By the following afternoon, Laura returned with a man in a gray suit. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and kind eyes that seemed to have seen it all. He introduced himself as Mr. Hanley, an attorney who often handled hospital consultations for patients in my position. His tone was professional, but there was a warmth beneath it, the kind that told me he had guided many people through their final choices. We spoke quietly in my room. The door closed, the blinds tilted to block wandering eyes. He asked me about my current will, my assets, and who they were intended for. I told him everything, how I had originally left everything to my children, how I had believed it was the natural course of things. His pen scratched across the notepad as he took careful notes. Then I paused, my throat tight, before confessing the truth. "They've abandoned me," I whispered. "They don't visit, they don't care, and when they do come, it's only to ask about what I'll leave behind." Mr. Hanley looked at me steadily, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He didn't interrupt. He let me pour out everything: the broken promises, the hollow visits, the vultures circling my bed. By the end, my voice shook, but I felt lighter, as though I had finally spoken the truth aloud for the first time. "You have every right," he said, gently, "to decide where your estate goes. It's not about what they expect, it's about what you want. And if you feel others have shown you more care, then it's your choice to honor them instead." For weeks, I had felt guilty, even entertaining the idea of cutting my children out. But hearing it spoken aloud, validated by someone who understood the law and, perhaps, human nature. It gave me strength. We discussed logistics. He explained that everything could be arranged right from my hospital bed. All I needed were witnesses, people who could confirm I was of sound mind and making the decision willingly. My nurse, perhaps another staff member, even Miguel, if I trusted him. The thought comforted me. I wouldn't be alone in this. For the first time in weeks, I felt not just alive, but purposeful. My illness still gnawed at my body, but my spirit had teeth again. I wasn't waiting to die, I was preparing to make one last stand. When Mr. Hanley left, he promised to return with the necessary documents. He assured me that my wishes would be honored, no matter how my children reacted. His calm confidence steadied me, like an anchor in a storm. After he was gone, I lay back against my pillows, my mind racing. I thought of the nurses who had become my daily companions, the ones who had sat by my side through sleepless nights, who had comforted me without asking for anything in return. I thought of Miguel, who always made sure my window blinds let in just enough light so I could see the sunset. These people had given me something my children never could in my final days: genuine care. The guilt that had once gnawed at me began to dissolve. This wasn't cruelty, this was justice. This was balance. And perhaps, in its own twisted way, this was love, giving my legacy to those who had shown me what love truly looked like. But even as I drifted to sleep that night, a shadow lingered in my thoughts, a whisper of doubt, of warning. My children didn't know yet. They still believed the future belonged to them. And once they discovered the truth, I knew they wouldn't accept it quietly. But even as I signed the first papers, I had no idea the storm it would unleash. Word spread quickly that I was changing my will. I never intended for them to know so soon. In my mind, the papers would be signed, sealed, and tucked away quietly until the day came when they were read aloud, when my children would learn the truth far too late to change it. But life has a cruel way of letting secrets slip. It started with a careless word from a nurse. She didn't mean harm, just a simple comment to my eldest daughter during a brief visit, something about me speaking with a lawyer. It was enough. And, like the first crack in a dam, the truth leaked out. And once my children caught wind of it, the flood came rushing in. The very next morning, my hospital room transformed. Suddenly, the chair that had sat empty for weeks was never vacant. My eldest arrived with a bouquet of roses so large it barely fit on the table. My son brought expensive chocolates I couldn't even eat with my failing appetite. My youngest arrived with a blanket, soft and new, claiming she wanted me to be comfortable. Their smiles were wide, their voices syrupy sweet, their touches too rehearsed. I could see it in their eyes, the desperation. It wasn't love that brought them to my bedside. It was fear. Fear that the inheritance they had already counted in their minds might be slipping away. At first, I said nothing. I let them fuss over me, adjust my pillows, pour me water I hadn't asked for. I let them chatter on about how much they missed me, about how busy they had been, but how they were determined to be here now. If I hadn't known the truth, perhaps I might have believed them. But I did know the truth, and that made every word drip with poison. It was almost comical, the way they tried to outdo one another. My eldest bragged about clearing her schedule so she could visit every day. My son claimed he had been checking in with the hospital staff all along, as though making a phone call equaled love. My youngest clung to my hand, whispering apologies for not being around, tears glistening in her eyes. But even her tears felt staged, like a performance for an audience of one. I watched them closely, and the more I observed, the colder I became. They didn't ask about my health in any meaningful way. They didn't want details of the treatments, the prognosis, or the pain I endured each night. Their questions danced around one subject: my future, my house, my savings, my jewelry. They asked carefully, but I heard it in every syllable. Their sudden affection wasn't about me, it was about what I represented, a fortune they believed belonged to them by right. When Miss Hanley visited again with the updated documents, their behavior shifted. My eldest cornered me, asking if it was true I was making changes. My son grew defensive, insisting that I must be confused, that surely I didn't mean to rewrite everything I had promised them. My youngest cried, insisting that if I left her with nothing, it would prove I never loved her. I listened, silent, as their protests filled the room. The guilt they tried to press on me was heavy, but not heavier than the weight of their abandonment. For every tear they shed, I remembered the nights I sat alone staring at that empty chair. For every argument they made, I recalled the shallow conversations about renovations and bank accounts. Their words bounced off me like stones against steel. Still, I played my part. I smiled weakly. I told them not to worry. I let them believe they still had a chance. All the while, I knew the papers were nearly finished. My will was no longer theirs to claim. At night, when they finally left, the nurses came in and shook their heads knowingly. They had seen it. Before families disappearing until money was mentioned, then reappearing like moths to a flame. One nurse whispered, "They don't deserve you." And I believed her. The irony was sharp. The very love I had craved for my children arrived only when they felt threatened. But it was too late. Their sudden kindness didn't soothe the wounds they had left. If anything, it deepened them, proving beyond doubt that I had been right to change everything. I began to feel stronger, even though my body continued to fail. Every fake smile they gave me, every hollow promise, only fueled the fire inside me. My revenge was not cruel, it was righteous. My legacy would not go to those who abandoned me. It would go to those who had held me up when I was at my lowest. But I knew my children well. They wouldn't let go easily. And as the days passed and their visits grew more frequent, I could see the cracks forming in their facades. The smiles began to falter. The voices grew sharper. The jealousy between them started to surface. They weren't just fighting for me, they were fighting for what they believed they were entitled to. One evening, as they bickered in hushed tones by the window, I lay back against my pillows and realized something profound. Their sudden attention didn't bring me comfort. It brought me clarity. I had been right all along. Their love was a mask, and it was slipping. But their sudden kindness only hardened my resolve. I began keeping a secret journal in my hospital bed. It started one restless night, when sleep refused to come and my thoughts swirled like a storm I couldn't quiet. The silence of the room was unbearable, but worse was the noise in my mind, the doubts, the memories, the anger. So I asked one of the nurses for a notebook and a pen. She looked at me curiously, but returned later with both, leaving them by my bedside with a gentle pat on my hand. At first, my writing was shaky, my hand weak from the IV lines and medication. But as the words spilled onto the paper, I found strength. Every entry was a confession, a testimony of everything I had endured. I wrote about the nights my children never came, about the empty chair that haunted me like a ghost. I wrote about their shallow visits, their greedy questions, their sudden change of tone once they heard about the will. I poured my soul into that journal, every word sharpening my resolve. It wasn't just a diary, it was evidence. If anyone ever questioned my decisions, if my children dared to claim I had been confused or manipulated, this book would speak for me. It would show the truth, that I was not weak, that I was not delusional, that I was fully aware of what I was doing. The act of writing gave me power. For so long, I had been silenced by my illness, by my children's neglect. But here, in ink, my voice was undeniable. Every page was a declaration. I matter. My choices matter. My love cannot be bought or begged for, it must be earned. The nurses noticed. They would see me scribbling, my eyes fierce, and they'd smile knowingly. One of them, a young woman named Carla, told me softly, "It's good. It keeps you strong." I nodded, but what I didn't tell her was that this journal wasn't just keeping me strong, it was becoming my weapon. Mr. Hanley, the lawyer, returned with the first drafts of the new will. He explained that witnesses would be required to confirm I was of sound mind, Without hesitation, I asked for Laura, the nurse who had been with me since the beginning, and Miguel, the janitor who had shown me more kindness than my own blood. When I told Miguel, his eyes widened in shock. Me? He asked, pointing to his chest as if I had mistaken him for someone else. Yes, you, I said firmly. You've treated me like family when my own family hasn't. I trust you. His face softened, and he bowed his head in quiet gratitude. I knew then that my choice was right. These people had nothing to gain from me, yet they gave me their compassion. They were the true witnesses of my life, and now they would be the witnesses of my last act. Each day, I added more to my journal. I wrote about the way my children suddenly hovered over me, pretending to care while their eyes betrayed impatience. I wrote about the bickering I overheard, their whispered arguments about what mom might leave behind. I described the way their tone changed the second they thought I was asleep, how they dropped the facade, their voices sharp with jealousy and suspicion. The journal became my mirror. It reflected not only their actions, but my transformation. I was no longer the fragile mother waiting for scraps of affection. I was the judge of my own legacy, and every stroke of the pen reminded me that my children's entitlement would not define me. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, I would hold the notebook to my chest like a shield. It was proof that I was still here, still thinking, still fighting. The machines might track my failing body, but the ink on those pages proved my mind was alive and clear. I began to imagine the day it would all be revealed. The day my children, dressed in black, sat expectantly in a room, waiting to hear what they thought they deserved. And then the words would be read aloud. Words they could not twist, could not erase, could not deny. My will would speak for me, and my journal would guard the truth. The more I wrote, the more I felt my strength return not to my body, but to my spirit. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't voiceless. I wasn't just a patient lying in a bed. I was a mother, a woman, and soon I would be a storm they never saw coming. Yet, as I fortified myself with words and witnesses, I began to sense something darker brewing around me. My children's visits grew more frequent, but also more tense. The fake sweetness slipped more often, replaced by sharp glances and whispered arguments. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't yet know the full truth. I caught my son rifling through the drawer of my bedside table one evening, pretending to look for tissues. My eldest daughter lingered by the counter, her eyes darting toward the papers my lawyer had left behind. My youngest began questioning me directly, asking if it was really true that I was making changes. I smiled softly, saying nothing. But my silence only seemed to fuel their panic. And in their panic, I could sense something dangerous taking shape. They weren't just worried anymore. They were plotting. But little did I know, my family was plotting behind my back. The change in their behavior was too obvious to ignore. At first, their visits had been drenched in syrupy sweetness smiles that didn't reach their eyes, hugs that felt staged, voices pitched too high with false concern. But as the days dragged on, the performance began to unravel. The mask of affection slipped, and what lay beneath was greed, raw, ugly, and impossible to hide. They started arriving more often, sometimes together, sometimes separately, but always with the same agenda: to keep an eye on me and on each other. I could feel it in the air the moment they walked into the room. The tension crackled like static before a storm. My eldest daughter would hover by the bed, asking questions that seemed caring on the surface but carried another meaning underneath. "Are you comfortable, Mom?" she'd ask, her eyes flicking to the documents on the tray table. "Do you need anything? Maybe help sorting your papers?" My son was less subtle. He would stand with his arms crossed, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Mom," he said one afternoon, his voice low but edged with irritation, "I heard you're making changes. Is that true?" I smiled faintly, feigning innocence. "Changes?" I echoed. "Oh, sweetheart, at my age, Everything is changing. He didn't laugh. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as though he could force the truth out of me by sheer will. My youngest tried a different tactic. She clung to me, holding my hand, her voice breaking into sobs. Mom, you wouldn't do that to us, would you? You wouldn't cut us out. We're your family. We're all you have. I let her words sink into the silence, offering no answer. Her tears were salt water, but they didn't wash away. The image burned into my memory. The endless nights I waited alone, staring at the empty chair beside me. The three of them began to bicker more openly, as though I were invisible. I lay in bed listening as they whispered sharply near the window. She knows what she's doing, my eldest hissed. You don't just call a lawyer for fun. She's confused, my son snapped back. She's sick, and someone's putting ideas in her head. It's that nurse, my youngest muttered bitterly. Or maybe that janitor. I've seen him talking to her. Maybe she's leaving things to strangers. Their voices rose until a nurse had to step in, telling them sharply to quiet down or leave. They smiled sheepishly at her, but the moment she walked out, the argument resumed. I lay there, pretending to sleep, my lips curled into the faintest smile. Their greed had exposed them. They no longer cared to hide it, and with every cruel word they spoke, every accusation they threw at each other, my resolve only grew stronger. One afternoon, my son leaned close, his voice low and urgent. Mom, listen to me. You can't do this. You raised us, you're supposed to leave it to us? That's the way it's done. Don't let people take advantage of you. I turned my head slowly, meeting his eyes. And where were you? I asked softly. When I needed you most. His face flushed red, and he looked away, unable to answer. It became a pattern. Each visit carried less warmth, more desperation. They began trying to one-up each other in front of me, bringing gifts, speaking with exaggerated sweetness, but their eyes betrayed their resentment. My eldest boasted about visiting the most. My son bragged about being the one who had always handled the finances responsibly. My youngest wept, insisting she was the only one who had ever truly loved me. They weren't fighting for me, they were fighting for what I represented. I let them. I let them tear at each other, expose themselves in ways they couldn't hide. I no longer felt sadness watching it unfold. I felt vindicated. Every cruel whisper, every fake smile, every jealous glare was confirmation that I was doing the right thing. When Mr. Hanley returned with the final draft of the new will, I didn't hesitate. The nurses stood as witnesses, Miguel at my side. My hands trembled slightly as I signed the papers, but my heart was steady. Every stroke of the pen was a declaration of freedom. I was no longer bound by guilt, no longer chained to the illusion that my children deserved everything I had built. The moment the ink dried, I felt lighter, as though a burden I had carried for decades had finally been set down. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of their anger, not of their judgment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had chosen myself. But as I glanced up from the papers, I saw my eldest daughter's shadow in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me, her face pale with shock. I hadn't realized she had arrived early. She had seen me sign. And that night, I signed the final version of my new will. The signing of the will was nothing short of liberation. When the pen left the paper and the lawyer gathered the documents into his briefcase, a wave of calm washed over me. For weeks, my life had felt like a series of losses, my health, my strength, my family's love. But in that moment, I had reclaimed something they could never take from me: my voice. I sank back into the pillows, my breath shallow but steady. The nurses who had witnessed the signing smiled softly, as if they understood the gravity of what I had just done. Miguel gave me a small nod, his eyes shining with a respect I hadn't seen from my own children in years. It wasn't about money for him. I knew that. It was about being seen, being trusted, being acknowledged. That was worth more than gold. Mr. Hanley assured me everything was airtight: the signatures, the witnesses, the documentation, all in order. He explained that no matter how loudly my children might protest, the law was on my side. "You've made your wishes clear," he said, his voice calm and certain. "And that's what matters." After he left, I felt lighter than I had in months. The fear that had clung to me, the guilt that had haunted my nights, was gone. I wasn't just a dying woman in a hospital bed anymore. I was a mother who had made her final decision, a woman who had taken back her power. I looked around the room, at the flowers my eldest had brought, now wilting in their vase, at the unopened chocolates from my son, at the blanket my youngest had draped over me with trembling hands. They were symbols of their false affection, hollow gestures meant to mask greed. I almost laughed, realizing they were nothing compared to the ink on that paper. They could bring me all the gifts in the world, but they couldn't undo what I had signed. For the first time, I felt peace in this sterile room. The hum of the machines didn't feel as oppressive. The silence didn't feel as sharp. My chest still ached with illness, but my heart no longer carried the unbearable weight of betrayal. I had given my children everything for decades. Now, I had finally given something to myself. The nurses noticed the change in me. Laura said I seemed brighter, lighter somehow. She teased that I was glowing, and I smiled at her, knowing she wasn't wrong. Freedom has a way of making even the sickest body feel strong. But peace is fragile, and I knew mine wouldn't last long. My children weren't fools. They had seen the papers, or at least enough of them to know something had shifted. The looks they gave me in the days that followed weren't filled with love or even fake sweetness anymore. They were filled with suspicion, with anger, with fear. Their visits became more frantic. My eldest tried to coax information out of me, her voice honeyed but her eyes sharp. My son grew louder, his tone accusatory, demanding to know what I had signed. My youngest oscillated between sobbing at my bedside and glaring at the staff, as though everyone else in the hospital was conspiring against her. I said nothing. I let them stew in their uncertainty. Silence became my shield, my greatest weapon. The less I said, the more their imaginations twisted, and the more desperate they became. Meanwhile, I found joy in small moments. Miguel continued to bring me flowers from his garden, placing them gently by my bed. Carla, the young nurse, would sit with me during the night shifts, telling me stories about her dreams and listening when I spoke about my regrets. I began to cherish those connections more than I ever thought possible. They weren't bound to me by blood, but by something deeper: genuine care. The contrast between them and my children was impossible to ignore. One night, as my son stormed out after another argument about my confusion, Miguel came in quietly to adjust the blinds so I could see the stars. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand explanations. He just gave. And in that quiet act, I understood with complete certainty that I had made the right choice. Still, a chill lingered in the air. My children weren't just angry, they were plotting. I could see it in their eyes when they thought I wasn't watching, in the way they whispered sharply in the hallway, in the tension that clung to them like a second skin. One evening, after a long day of forced smiles and thinly veiled arguments, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I should have felt safe, knowing the will was signed and sealed, but a gnawing feeling crept into me. This wasn't the end. My children weren't going to accept this quietly. They had too much pride, too much greed. I remembered the way my eldest daughter's eyes had widened when she saw me sign, the way my son's fists clenched when I refused to answer his questions, the way my youngest's sobs had turned into sharp whispers the moment she thought I was asleep. These weren't the reactions of children who had accepted their mother's choice. These were the signs of war brewing. And though I had braced myself for their disappointment, I hadn't yet realized the lengths they were willing to go. And soon enough, their true faces would return with vengeance. The very next week, my children stormed into the hospital room. There was no warning, no polite knock, no hesitant step through the door. They burst in like a storm breaking glass, faces twisted with rage, voices sharp enough to slice through the sterile air. My eldest daughter led the charge, her cheeks flushed, her eyes blazing. Behind her, my son's jaw was clenched tight, fists balled at his sides. My youngest trailed close, her face streaked with tears, though whether they were real or manufactured, I could no longer tell. The room, once my sanctuary, became a battlefield. They didn't even glance at the nurses bustling nearby or the other patients walking past in the hallway. Their anger burned too brightly to be contained. "Mom," my eldest spat, her voice trembling with fury. "What are you doing? We know you changed the will. We know you've been meeting with that lawyer." I said nothing at first. I sat upright in my bed, hands folded neatly in my lap, letting their words fill the silence. My son stepped forward, his voice louder, sharper. "This is insane. Who's putting these ideas in your head? Is it that janitor? The nurses? Are they manipulating you?" His eyes darted around the room as though searching for the conspirators. My youngest tears spilled over as she dropped to her knees beside my bed. "Mom, please," she begged, clutching my hand as though she could hold me back from slipping away. "Don't do this to us. We're your children. We're all you have." I studied their faces, the desperation etched into every line. If I had still been the woman I was weeks ago, lonely, guilt-ridden, desperate for their affection, perhaps I would have broken. But not now. Not after everything. Not after signing my truth into law. "You had your chance," I said softly, my voice steady despite the weakness of my body. "You had weeks, months, years to show me love, and you didn't." The silence that followed was deafening. My words hit them harder than I expected, but only for a moment. Then their anger roared back, fiercer than before. My eldest daughter snapped, "This isn't about love, it's about what's right. We're your children. It's our inheritance. It belongs to us." I tilted my head, my lips curling into a bitter smile. "Belongs to you? Or something you expected without earning?" My son slammed his fist against the wall, startling even the nurses who rushed in to intervene. "You don't know what you're doing. You're sick. You're confused. You're letting strangers take advantage of you. We won't let this happen." The words rolled over me, sharp and venomous. But instead of fear, I felt something else. Vindication. Their fury was proof of everything I had written in my journal, proof of everything I had known in my heart. They didn't care about me. They cared about what I could give them. The nurses stepped in, their voices firm as they reminded my children that I was of sound mind, that I had the right to make my own decisions. Laura, the nurse who had witnessed my will, placed a protective hand on my shoulder. "She knows exactly what she's doing," she said firmly. My children turned on her instantly, their voices rising in accusation. "You manipulated her!" my son shouted. "You're using her! All of you are!" Miguel happened to be passing by, and when he heard the commotion, he stepped inside, his broad frame blocking part of the doorway. "Enough," he said quietly, but with such force that the room stilled for a moment. My eldest glared at him as though he were the enemy. "And you? You think you deserve anything from her? You're nothing. You're just someone who cared when you didn't." I interrupted sharply. Her mouth snapped shut, her face pale with shock. For a brief second, silence returned. I could see it now, the cracks in their facade spreading wide. They weren't here to love me. They weren't here to comfort me. They were here to fight, to claw, to demand what they thought was theirs. The truth was no longer hidden. It was alive in every angry word, every glare, every tearless sob. I leaned back against my pillows, my voice soft but cutting. "You've shown me who you really are, and I've made my choice." My youngest sobs grew louder, more dramatic, but her grip on my hand tightened like a vice. My son paced like a caged animal, his anger shaking the room. My eldest crossed her arms, her fury simmering just beneath her skin. In that moment, I realized something chilling. They weren't just angry. They weren't just hurt. They were plotting. And they wouldn't stop at shouting. But I didn't realize they weren't going to give up so easily. The threats began quietly, but they grew louder with each passing day. At first, it was nothing more than sharp words muttered under their breath. Little barbs slipped into conversation when they thought no one else was listening. My eldest would lean close, her voice low and cutting. "You'll regret this." My son would pace by the window, fists clenched, hissing. "We'll find a way to stop you." My youngest, still playing the role of the broken-hearted daughter, would clutch my hand with trembling fingers and whisper, "You're confused, Mom. You don't know what you're doing." But soon the whispers became open threats. One evening, they crowded into my room together, their faces masks of false calm stretched over fury. My son spoke first, his tone flat and cold. "We've been talking. If you go through with this, we'll contest it. We'll tell the court you weren't in your right mind." My eldest chimed in, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "They'll believe us." "You're sick, Mom. Everyone can see it." "Do you really think anyone will take your word over ours?" My youngest cried softly, her voice quivering as she added, "You're being manipulated. That lawyer, those nurses, that janitor, they're using you. And when you're gone, what happens then? Your legacy wasted on strangers?" I listened, calm, though my heart beat hard in my chest. Their words were knives, but they no longer cut the way they once did. I had already bled enough. Now, their threats only confirmed the truth I had been writing in my journal for weeks. They weren't fighting for me, they were fighting for money. "You can try," I told them quietly, "but the truth is on my side." They scoffed, shaking their heads, as though my words were nothing more than the ramblings of a delusional old woman. But I wasn't delusional. I was clear, sharper than I had ever been. After they left in a storm of angry whispers, Mr. Hanley came to see me. I told him everything, every threat, every accusation. He listened carefully, his face stern. When I finished, he said firmly, "Don't be afraid. You are of sound mind, Evelyn. And if they try to challenge you, we'll fight back. You're not alone in this." His certainty steadied me. The guilt that had once haunted me was gone, replaced by a new determination. My children could scream, they could threaten, smear my name in court, but they couldn't take away the truth. The nurses became my silent army. Laura promised she would testify, swearing she had seen my clarity every single day. Carla, the young nurse, said she'd stand by me too, describing how I had spoken with strength and reason during our late-night conversations. Even Miguel, who had nothing to gain, vowed to tell the court exactly what he had witnessed. For the first time in years, I felt protected not by my family, but by strangers who had become more like family than blood ever had. Still, I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. The thought of legal battles loomed heavy in my mind. I had seen enough of the world to know how messy courts could be, how easily money and manipulation twisted the truth. My children weren't just greedy, they were relentless, and they were willing to destroy me to get what they believed they deserved. At night, I replayed their threats in my mind. "You're confused. You'll regret this. We'll stop you." Those words echoed louder than the beeping machines in my room. My hands trembled sometimes, not from weakness, but from the anticipation of the fight ahead. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a growing fire. I remembered all the times in my life when I had been underestimated, dismissed, ignored. When my husband died, everyone said I couldn't raise 3 children alone, but I did. When money was tight, people doubted I could hold 2 jobs and still care for my family. But I did. And now, my children thought they could strip me of my dignity with lies. But they were wrong. One night, after another heated confrontation with them, I turned to my journal and wrote a single sentence in bold, deliberate strokes. "I will not let them win." The words burned on the page, steady and certain. The following days were filled with tension. My children hovered around me constantly, their fake affection gone, replaced with barely concealed hostility. They argued with the nurses. They glared at Miguel when he entered the room. They snapped at each other, the cracks in their alliance widening as their greed poisoned even their bond as siblings. I sat in silence, watching it unfold. Every fight, every accusation, every moment of ugliness was fuel for me. They were proving my point better than I ever could. And when the time came, I would make sure the world saw them for what they truly were. I knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even begun. My children were planning something bigger than angry words and whispered threats. I could see it in their eyes when they left my room, could feel it in the heavy silence they left behind. They weren't going to stop, and neither was I. And so, I prepared for the final war over my legacy. Court papers arrived at my hospital bedside. The nurse brought them in, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the envelope on the tray beside my bed. I could see it in her eyes before I even tore it open. She knew what it meant. My children had done it. They had filed to contest my will. I stared at the envelope for a long moment, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Even though I had expected it, even though I had heard their threats and seen the fury in their eyes, a part of me still hoped they wouldn't go this far. A mother always hopes, even when she knows better. With shaky fingers, I slid the papers out. My lawyer, Mr. Hanley, sat across from me, his face unreadable but steady. He had warned me this was likely. He had told me they would try to paint me as confused, weak, manipulated. But seeing the words printed in black and white was like a blade piercing straight through my chest. They claimed I wasn't of sound mind, that I had been influenced by outsiders, that my judgment was clouded by illness. My own children were willing to strip me of my dignity in front of strangers just to get their hands on what I had built. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. I had cried too many tears already. Instead, I pressed my lips together and let the rage burn hotter inside me. Mr. Hanley placed a steady hand on my arm. "We'll fight this," he assured me. "You're clear, Evelyn. Stronger than most of the clients I've ever represented, and you have witnesses who'll stand with you." Witnesses. That word gave me strength. Laura, who had seen me every day, who had spoken with me about everything from my meals to my memories. Carla, who had spent long nights at my side, listening to my thoughts with full clarity. Miguel, who had treated me with kindness and respect, who had nothing to gain but the truth. They would speak for me. They would tell the world I wasn't confused, that I knew exactly what I was doing. Still, the betrayal cut deep. My children weren't just fighting for money anymore. They were fighting to erase my voice, to silence me even before I died. They wanted the world to believe I was incapable of making choices, incapable of knowing what was best for myself. That was the cruelest wound of all, not their absence, not their greed, but their attempt to strip me of my very identity. That night, I broke down. When the room was dark and the hospital quiet, I buried my face in the pillow and let the sobs rack my frail body. I cried for the children I thought I had raised, for the love I thought would last, for the legacy I had once dreamed of leaving behind. The grief was so heavy I thought it might crush me. But then a soft knock came at the door. Miguel stepped in, holding a small bowl of soup he had made at home. He set it gently on the tray, then pulled up the chair beside me. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He simply said, "You're not alone." Those three words broke through the darkness. For years, I had carried the burden of being alone, even when surrounded by people I had called family. And now, in my weakest moment, it was a man with no blood tie to me who gave me the comfort my own children could not. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly, and whispered, "Thank you." My tears had dried, replaced with steel. If my children wanted a war, I would give them one. They thought my illness made me weak, that my loneliness made me easy to manipulate, but they didn't understand the fire that comes from betrayal, the strength that rises when you are pushed past breaking. Mr. Hanley came again, explaining the next steps. I would need to testify, even if only briefly. My witnesses would be called. Evidence would be presented. My journal, he said, could become a crucial piece proof in my own handwriting that I was aware, deliberate, and unwavering in my choice. I looked at him and nodded. Then let's fight. He smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. That's the spirit I knew you had. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The nurses helped me organize my thoughts, reminding me of the things I had said and done clearly each day. Miguel rehearsed his testimony with the lawyer, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each practice. And I wrote, filling page after page of my journal with my truth, as if each word was a shield against the lies my children would soon unleash. Yet beneath the determination, a chill lingered. Courtrooms were brutal places, and my children were desperate. I knew they would stop at nothing, not even destroying my reputation to win. Still, as I sat with the pen in my hand, scrawling my truth across the paper, I whispered to myself, they can try to silence me, but they will never erase me. And with that, my hospital bed became the battlefield for my last war. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and hidden lies. The moment I was wheeled into the room, the air shifted. My children were already there, seated together at one long table, their faces stiff with determination. They looked polished, rehearsed, like actors waiting for their cue. My eldest had chosen a somber black dress, her expression a mask of sorrow. My son wore a sharp suit, his jaw set with grim authority. My youngest dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, tears falling perfectly on cue. It might have fooled strangers, but not me. I knew every twitch of their mouths, every flicker in their eyes. They weren't grieving children fighting for their mother's dignity. They were performers, playing their roles in a desperate bid for money. Mr. Hanley positioned himself beside me, calm and steady, his presence a shield. He leaned down and whispered, just remember, Evelyn, you've already won by knowing the truth. Today, we make it undeniable. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. My children's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of a fragile old woman whose mind had been clouded by illness, whose judgment had been swayed by outsiders. He spoke with conviction, his voice rising with practiced drama, claiming my decisions were unnatural and against the bonds of family. As he spoke, my children nodded solemnly, their eyes cast downward in feigned sorrow. They played their parts well, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. They weren't mourning me, they were mourning their imagined inheritance. When it was our turn, Mr. Hanley rose with quiet confidence. He began simply, Evelyn is of sound mind, and we have proof. One by one, my witnesses stepped forward. Laura, the nurse, testified first. She spoke clearly, her voice unwavering, as she described our conversations. She told the court how I had spoken about my childhood, my late husband, the details of my treatments, and the clarity with which I expressed my wishes. Her words were precise, her compassion undeniable. Next came Carla, the young nurse. She described our late-night talks, how I had told her about my regrets and my hopes. She painted a picture of a woman who wasn't delusional or confused, but thoughtful, deliberate, and heartbreakingly aware. Then Miguel took the stand. At first, he looked nervous, tugging at his shirt, his hands fidgeting, but when he began to speak, his voice carried a raw honesty that silenced the room. He told them about the times he had found me alone, the small conversations we'd shared, the way I spoke with clarity and purpose. And then his voice broke as he said, she's treated me like family when her own wouldn't. She knew exactly what she was doing when she trusted me. And I'll stand by her truth. I watched my children shift uncomfortably in their seats, their masks cracking as each word landed like a blow. Finally, it was my turn. They wheeled me to the witness stand, my frail body trembling, but my mind sharp as steel. I looked directly at the judge and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I raised my children with everything I had. I gave them my time, my love, my sacrifices. But when I needed them most, they weren't there. My decisions aren't about revenge. They're about truth. The truth is that love isn't measured in blood, it's measured in presence, in loyalty, in care. And those who stood by me when my own children did not, those are the people I choose to honor with what little I leave behind. This is not confusion. This is clarity. The room was silent. For a moment, even my children's lawyer looked uneasy. Then came the questions. My children's lawyer tried to rattle me, asking dates, details, pushing to prove I was incoherent, but I answered each question calmly. I told them the date of my husband's death, the names of my doctors, the very words my children had spoken to me when they dismissed my needs. I didn't falter. My voice may have been weak, but my truth was iron. When it was over, I saw the shift in the judge's eyes. He wasn't fooled. He had heard the difference between rehearsed lies and lived truth. The ruling came swiftly. The will was valid. My mind was sound. My wishes would be honored. I looked across the courtroom at my children, their faces twisted in shock, then fury. My eldest's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes blazing with hatred. My son slammed his hand against the table, his mask of control shattering. My youngest sobbed louder, not with grief, but with rage. And in that moment, sitting frail in my wheelchair, I felt stronger than ever. I had won. My truth had prevailed. My voice had not been silenced. And in that moment, I knew my victory was complete. After court, the silence from my children was deafening. For weeks, their voices had filled my hospital room sharp, demanding, furious. They had stormed in like soldiers ready for battle, fought me with accusations and lies, dragged me into courtrooms filled with venom. But once the ruling was made, once the judge declared my will valid and my mind clear, the noise stopped. They didn't visit anymore. The chair by my bedside remained empty, untouched, almost mocking in its stillness. No flowers, no chocolates, no hollow apologies. Nothing. For the first time in months, my children were completely gone. And though part of me mourned that silence, another part embraced it. There was no more pretending, no more fake smiles or forced hugs, no more waiting at the door for footsteps that would never come. The silence was painful, yes, but it was honest. And I had learned, in these final days of my life, that honesty was worth more than any illusion of love. The nurses filled the void, as they always had. Laura still came in each morning, cheerful and steady, fluffing my pillows and asking how I'd slept. Carla still sat with me at night, sharing her dreams of becoming a head nurse one day, listening patiently as I whispered my memories. Miguel still stopped by, always with something small: flowers, soup, even just a smile that warmed the sterile room. It was strange, but I no longer felt like a patient abandoned by her family. I felt like a woman surrounded by a new kind of family, one built not on blood, but on kindness. I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I still had. There was laughter in my room again, quiet conversations, moments of connection. These people, who owed me nothing, gave me everything my children could not. They didn't care about my inheritance, they cared about me. Sometimes, late at night, I allowed myself to remember the good moments with my children. The Christmas mornings filled with wrapping paper and laughter. The birthdays where I baked cakes from scratch, watching their faces light up. The nights when I held them close after nightmares, whispering promises that they would never be alone. Those memories were real and they were mine, but I also knew they belonged to another time before greed poisoned what we had. I forgave myself for holding on too long, for believing they would come around, for giving them chance after chance. A mother's love is stubborn, but even the deepest well runs dry when there's nothing left to refill it. My health continued to decline. Some days, I barely had the strength to sit up. The nurses spoke gently, preparing me for what was to come. I could feel it in my bones, too, the heaviness in my chest, the fatigue that clung to me like a shadow. My body was surrendering, even as my spirit remained defiant. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of dying, not of leaving this world. I had faced the truth, spoken my story, and secured my legacy. My children could no longer rewrite me into someone I wasn't. The will stood, my choices locked in ink and witnessed by those who had truly seen me. One afternoon, Miguel sat with me by the window. The sun streamed in, warm against my skin, and he handed me a single daisy from his garden. "For you," he said simply. I took it, holding it carefully in my frail hands, and whispered, "You've been more of a son to me than my own ever were." His eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, embarrassed by the emotion. But I meant it. Blood may bind, but love defines. And in the end, Miguel's kindness spoke louder than all the empty words my children had ever given me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the daisy resting on the table beside me. The silence pressed in, but it didn't scare me anymore. It felt like peace, like a final exhale after years of holding my breath. I thought of my husband, wondering if he could see me now, if he would understand the choices I had made. I believed he would. He had always trusted me to protect our family, and though our children had failed us, I had protected something greater: my dignity, my voice, my truth. The days were numbered now. I could feel it. My body was tired, my breaths shallow. But my heart was light. I wasn't leaving behind bitterness, I was leaving behind justice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered, "This is the ending I chose." My last days were filled not with loneliness, but with unexpected love. By then, my body was frail, my breaths shallow, each one feeling like it might be my last. But unlike the weeks of emptiness I had endured before, my hospital room was no longer a place of despair. It had become something else: quiet, warm, alive, with the presence of people who cared, not because of obligation or greed, but because of genuine kindness. The nurses came often, not just to check my vitals, but to sit with me, to laugh with me, to remind me I was still more than just a patient waiting for her time. Miguel never failed to bring a flower or a smile, sometimes both. Even the cafeteria lady, who had once slipped me pudding cups, visited with gentle words. They filled the silence my children had abandoned me to, and in their presence, I finally understood. Love had found me again. I thought a lot about legacy during those days, not just the money or the house or the jewelry, but the story I was leaving behind. For years, I had been defined by sacrifice, by giving without asking in return. And though it ended in betrayal, it also ended in strength. I had taken control of my story, refused to be erased, and chosen to leave behind something that reflected the truth of who I was. I began writing a letter, my final words to be left with the will. My hands trembled, but my heart guided every word. I told my children that I had loved them deeply, more than they could ever know. But that love was not blind. I reminded them of the nights I stayed awake for them, the sacrifices I made, the life I gave up so theirs could be better. And then I told them why I chose to change everything. That abandonment has consequences. That love is not measured in inheritance, but in presence. That I hoped one day, long after the anger faded, they would understand. To those I had chosen: Miguel, the nurses, the charity I had quietly supported for years, I wrote words of gratitude. They may not have been my blood, but they had been my lifeline. They reminded me that family is chosen through love, not just born into existence. Each day felt shorter than the one before. I found myself sleeping more, drifting in and out of dreams where my husband was waiting for me, standing in the sunlight, smiling with the warmth I had missed for so long. The pain was less frightening now. Death was no longer a shadow. I feared it was a door I was preparing to walk through. On my final night, the room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp. Miguel sat by my side, holding my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. Laura came in to check on me, her smile tinged with sadness, but her touch steady as always. Carla leaned over, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders, whispering, "You're safe." I could barely speak, but I whispered one last thank you. To them, to life, to the strange, winding road that had led me here. My chest rose and fell one last time, and then, with peace in my heart, I let go. The world didn't stop when I did. The machines were silenced, my bed emptied, my body carried away. But my voice lived on, sealed in the papers and the letter I had left behind. When the will was read, I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine it clearly. My children, gathered together, still clinging to hope, expecting what they believed was rightfully theirs. And then the revelation. The nurses received enough to ease their burdens, to honor the care they had shown me. Miguel received not just money, but my home, the place where I had raised my children, the place that would now belong to someone who truly valued it. A portion went to a charity that would help struggling mothers, the kind of women I had once been. And my children? They were left only with tokens, objects of memory, not wealth. A locket, a photograph, a book I had read to them when they were small. Things that meant more than money ever could. But things they could never sell for profit. I could imagine their faces, the shock, the rage, the grief not for me, but for what they had lost. And perhaps, in the silence that followed, a glimmer of realization that, in the end, love cannot be bought, and betrayal carries its own price. I did not die abandoned. I did not die voiceless. I did not die powerless. I died free. In the end, I wasn't abandoned. I was finally free.